Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is another Mondays with Melba. So, welcome everyone and happy Women's History Month. I will be sprinkling a few interesting things to note. Of course, last week we talked about Autumn Lockwood, who was the first African American woman to win a Super Bowl as part of the coaching team of the Philly Eagles. So wanted to lift that back up again, and I'll be back next week with more interesting details from women's history. So starting off on our cases for today. First off, we have the case of Richard Glossop. So Richard Glossop had been serving nearly 3 decades on Oklahoma's death row as a result of a homicide that happened back in the 90s. Well, the Supreme Court has come back, the U.S. Supreme Court, let's be clear, came back and ruled that he is to receive a new trial. Why? Because prosecutors failed to correct false testimony of a witness that would have very clearly influenced a jury. So here's the deal. He was convicted back in 1998 as the alleged mastermind of a murder-for-hire scheme that targeted his boss out of Oklahoma City. Now, this was a gentleman by the name of Barry Van Treese, and he owned this motel. Now, the whole case started back in January of 1997 when the victim in this case, Van Treese, he was a 54-year-old father of 7, was beaten to death in his motel by a defendant by the name of Justin Sneed. Justin Sneed at the time was 19 years old. He was staying at the hotel in exchange, basically staying there for free in exchange for doing work, odd jobs and things like that, maintenance and all of that. So how Glossop gets in the frame is that he apparently knew Sneed, and initially when he was questioned back when the homicide occurred, he denied any knowledge of the killing, and then eventually was like, actually, no, it's this dude Sneed who did it, and he's told me that he committed this homicide. He explained to the cops, like, listen, I didn't want to say anything because he felt that because he failed to call the police as soon as he learned of this information, it would be construed or believed that he was already involved in it. So basically, he didn't want to say anything because he didn't want to get caught up in, the legal process of this. And well, unfortunately, that's what happened regardless. So at first, he was charged with accessory after the fact. So basically, you're helping the person conceal or kind of get away with the crime, right? But, his good friend Sneed rolled over and flipped on him and said, well, nope, it was Glossop who was the mastermind. He's the one who told me to do it, the whole thing. So basically, he said the motive that Glossop had for quote unquote masterminding this homicide is that he wanted to take over the hotel and run it himself. Okay. So Glossop all along is like, this wasn't me. I didn't do it. I'm innocent. I had nothing to do with this. Well, his charge ended up getting upgraded to capital murder as a result of the statements that Sneed made. And then, trial time came around and Glossop was like, I'm not taking a plea. I did not do this. I am innocent. And so he even got a plea like, listen, we'll give you a life sentence. We'll take the death penalty off the table. He was not trying to hear what prosecutors have to say. He's like, listen, I am innocent, period, end of story. Pull down the jury. Let's do this. So he ends up going to trial. They offered Sneed, the actual person that committed the homicide, a life sentence in exchange for his testimony. And so again, at trial, it was Glossop is the mastermind. This is all because of him, et cetera, et cetera. Well, jury believed Sneed and the evidence that the prosecutors presented, and he was convicted and sentenced to death in 1998. But that initial conviction got overturned on appeal because of ineffective assistance of counsel. So basically, if your attorney is not paying attention in court, not making timely objections to preserve your right to be able to appeal, not giving you the offers that the prosecution may be extending to you, not explaining to you the consequences of certain things, that can be considered ineffective assistance of counsel. And if that's the case, then you did not get correct representation, therefore the case gets overturned. It happens more than people think, but it's a very terrible situation, and you never want your name as an attorney associated with that. So the case ended up being retried in 2004, and yet again, he was convicted and sentenced to death. But interestingly, years later, 2 independent investigations cast major doubt on Glossop's conviction. And it turns out that the state had evidence that Sneed, the actual murderer, told prosecutors that he was under the care of a jail psychiatrist who diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and prescribed him lithium for that. But when Sneed got on the stand to testify, he denied ever seeing a psychiatrist and said that he was asking for cold medicine and somehow he got lithium. He doesn't know how that happened. Well, Justice Sotomayor from the U.S. Supreme Court had said clearly that basically the fact that the prosecutors did not correct him and be like, dude, you're not telling the truth right now. Like, we know that you have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and you're taking medication because of it, that basically it would have undermined his credibility. Right? So if the prosecutor said, yeah, you're lying about this thing, then of course the jury's like, well, if you're lying about seeing a psychiatrist, what else are you lying about? So of course it was not in the prosecutor's best interest at that moment to correct him because, again, it was going to tank the case. So Justice Sotomayor, in her opinion, further states, besides Sneed, no other witness and no physical evidence established that Glossop orchestrated Van Treese's murder. So right there, it's a wrap. So again, case gets overturned, and now the question is, what's going to happen now? This case is now nearly 30 years old. Normally, retrying a case is to the benefit of the prosecution, just from the standpoint of you see the errors of what happened the first time around, you can tweak your case accordingly, and you can maybe do a little extra digging in terms of investigation to tighten up the things that, gave the jury pause. But that only works when you have a shorter time frame. 30 years later is a practical impossibility just because of the fact of, number one, people's memories fade. Number two, people pass away. Police officers, detectives retire, can't find them, whatever the case may be. So basically, it's almost like trying to revive a cold case. It's very difficult. But then on top of that, the Supreme Court basically said Sneed's a liar. So this is your star witness. And that is the problem when you try cases with something that's just basically an admission and barely a little bit of evidence. When you hang your entire case on a confession or a statement like this is the types of problems you run into. Because there's nothing else to point Glossop as being the person that masterminded or in some shape or form committed this homicide. So now, basically, prosecutors have a tough decision to make. The Glossop's family are like, do it again. We want him to be in prison for the rest of his life or, dead via the death penalty. Period. End of story. They don't want to hear anything else about that. But prosecutors have to look practically as to, do they even have a case to put forward at this point? Another interesting wrinkle in this case is that besides Glossop's defense attorneys, the fight to spare his life had a huge ally in pro-death penalty Republicans. Most notably, Oklahoma Attorney General Gunter Drummond. He and others have said that it's important for Oklahomans to have faith in the death penalty and making sure that it's being fairly administrative and that Glossop's execution would erode trust in the state's justice system, given all the questions that surrounded his case. So we will see what happens from there. If I had to take bets, I would say that this case is not going to be retried. Again, he served 28 years in prison, ostensibly for a crime he didn't commit. Let the man go home. I mean, my heart breaks for the family, but the true murderer is behind bars serving a life sentence. Sneed is the person that took Mr. Van Treese from this earth, and he is serving a life sentence for that. Here, you've got too much mess, too many questions, and you're not going to have enough evidence to go forward. But that's why it's so important for prosecutors to do it and do it right the first time. There was no reason not to correct your star witness right then and there, because then you could have maybe found a way to explain it in closing arguments. You could have tried to bring in other experts to kind of clean things up a bit. But by saying nothing, you've now tanked the case permanently, and you can never really go forward effectively in trying Mr. Glossop again. So there's that. Now, second case I'm covering today, we're back to France. So remember I reported extensively on the Gisèle Pellicot case. Well, now we have another one. And this is the case of Joël Lescornic, who is or was a 74-year-old French surgeon. He's now no longer a doctor. In this incredibly and massive trigger warning here, y'all, because what I'm about to talk about is like gross beyond belief. He has been accused of sexually assaulting close to 299 children over the course of his career. Almost 300 children. So these crimes have been alleged to have occurred between 1989 and 2014 across 10 different hospitals that he worked in. The average age of the victims were 11, but the youngest was 2 years old. 2 years old. I can't. I mean, I know I'm trying to give you all the information, but this is just so my heart just shattered when I read this story. And so this is France's largest child abuse trial in their history. And we're talking about a span of 25 years, nearly 300 children that have been victimized in the most vile way possible. The investigation actually started in 2017 after a 6-year-old neighbor reported inappropriate behavior on the part of Lescornic, and that led to a search of his home. When they searched his home, they discovered diaries detailing the abuse. And when I say detailing everything, and over 300,000 child abuse images. Just unbelievable. But prior to 2017, in 2005, he was previously convicted for possessing child pornography. And he still got to continue his medical practice and deal with children. Yeah. So interestingly, around that time, at least 3 doctors alerted authorities yo, this dude is a problem. He cannot be practicing. And they shared their concerns, and that was substantiated by court documents as well as testimony from one of the doctors. And following the 2005 conviction of this defendant, one of a psychiatrist who was also working at one of the hospitals where the defendant worked, a gentleman by the name of Thierry Bonvalot, and he basically confronted him and was like, dude, you gotta go. What you're gross. What you're doing is disgusting. You gotta leave these kids alone. And he said, quote, I told him that he was dangerous and that his place wasn't at the hospital. I asked him to resign. After a long silence, he put his head in his hands, and Lescornic responded, you can't make me. So the evidence at the center of this case is all about the diaries where it actually depicted the actual vile things he did to these children. His attorney, of course, is like, no, these are fantasies. It's not really what he did. But if you're fantasizing that way, no. No, no, I don't think so. You're deeply disturbed. You're deeply, deeply disturbed. And these diaries were so comprehensive and so detailed. I mean, that it noted the time, the place of the assaults, the victims' identities, even their addresses. And much like in the Giselle Pellicot case, because remember, Giselle Pellicot was passed out, her husband was drugging her and having men come over and sexually assault her. She didn't know about all of this until there was an investigation having to do with something different that her husband had done. And that's how they discovered all these images and realized that she had been abused for years. It's a similar situation here, that he basically documented all of these things, probably just to read it and relive it. And literally, the police had the horrible job of going to these people who are now adults. Okay, because remember, all of this was happening from way back in the day for over 25 years. So you have full grown adults who are learning that they were sexually assaulted as a child by their doctor. Some of them had, vague memories because a lot of times this occurred while the children were under anesthesia for different, procedures or whatever the case may be. So some of them had no idea. Some of them had foggy memories that something was wrong. Some of them knew but were afraid to speak out. So it's just mind-boggling, the amount of people who are now finding out and having their peace and life shattered to realize they had been violated in this way as a child. And so the court documents that were submitted by the prosecution note that he admitted that he started the journal in 1990, where he was writing regularly all the way up to 2016, a year before his retirement, with 40 to more than 100 pages of entries per year. There are some very detailed things that are in these journals that I'm not even going to bring up because, literally, I think I would puke just even saying it. But if you want to do your research on that, please feel free to go ahead. But I can't even repeat that. During the trial, the defendant admitted to the majority of the charges, expressing remorse. Okay, whatever. He's already serving a 15-year sentence for the 2020 conviction involving abusing 4 girls. If he's found guilty in this trial, he faces an additional 20 years in prison. Of course, people like these are always married, right? They have a beautiful cover. They look like a normal family, but in reality, depravity is happening. So the wife claims she knew nothing of this. But in a bombshell moment in court, the defendant admitted that he sexually abused his granddaughter, the 12-year-old daughter of his eldest son. As you can imagine, this case sparked huge outrage in France. How was this allowed to go on for so long? How is it that so many people knew or knew signs, or they had reported to authorities, and yet nothing happened? It was just suspended sentence here, a couple months in jail there, but they still allowed him to practice medicine. They still allowed him to have access to children. And so, sadly, because of the statute of limitations in France, much like we deal with in the US, the statute of limitations in France on sexual assault is 30 years. So there is about 80 people who could not be included in this trial because the statute of limitations had run. And so now, of course, everybody's looking at the systemic failures here and the broader movement around the silencing of people that have been abused, whether it's, women that have been sexually assaulted, children that have been sexually abused. And again, it brings into question and into the frame whether money, status, class, position are the things that are allowing predators to run free and continue to harm the public with no repercussions. So I will keep you posted on this highly grotesque case because, again, I'm pretty sure that this is going to be guilty verdict, plus he's going to get another 20 years, but I can't even imagine the multitude of lives that have been shattered. And again, I mean, imagine being a 40, 50-year-old person with a family of your own, and you're wondering why you sometimes have intimacy issues, or you're wondering why you can't sleep properly. And now you find out the reason why is because you had been violated as a child and had no one to protect you, no one to stop this from happening. It's just heartbreaking. So the last case I'm going to end with, as I had probably talked about before, one of my big passions are missing and murdered people of color. We've heard of basically what they call the Gabby Petito effect, where basically many times when you see Natalie Holloway and JonBenet Ramsey and, folks like that, many times you see, this adorable blonde-haired, blue-eyed, beautiful young child, and it just plays really well in the media. And so many people pay attention to these types of cases, but sadly, people of color don't always get that same kind of media attention. Again, some of it due to stereotypes, thinking, well, due to the lifestyle the person leads, they probably just took off, or, blatant racism, whatever the case may be. There's a number of reasons as to why that may be so. But I want to do my part in raising awareness around people that have gone missing and families that deserve closure. So the case I'm going to talk about is from 2013, and this is the case of Kendrick Johnson. He was a 17-year-old student who was found dead, wrapped up in a wrestling mat at Lowndes High School in Valdosta, Georgia. His body had facial bruises, lacerations, and other injuries. But the investigation was quite strange. So first off, the coroner, medical examiner, responded to the scene to, look at the body and start to make initial assessments. Well, the coroner said that law enforcement didn't cooperate at the scene and that the body had been moved, which is like sin number one when it comes to crime scene anything, right? When you get to a crime scene, you do not touch anything. Period, end of story. It has to be photographed, documented, tested, because even the positioning of where the body is can tell a story and help point the finger towards who might have done this, right? And so the official autopsy actually ruled the death as accidental positional asphyxiation. So basically saying, the narrative is basically like somehow he was reaching for something, fell into a mat, hit his head, rolled himself around into the mat, and then suffocated, which makes absolutely no sense. So the family of Kendrick Johnson actually ordered a second autopsy, and the second autopsy shows that he died from blunt force trauma, which means that's not you fell over and hit your head. Somebody hit you and ended your life. On top of that, surveillance footage from the gym around that time was missing. Why would that be? That suggests tampering. On top of that, when Kendrick's body was returned to his family, it was returned without internal organs. The internal organs were replaced with newspaper. Why? You don't do that. That's even when they do an autopsy, they put things back. The desecration of his body just says volumes here, okay? Volumes. And so the Georgia Bureau of Investigation delayed the autopsy report beyond the legal time frame, and they omitted some significant injuries. Again, that would lead to the conclusion that this was a homicide and not an accident. Photographs and analysis suggest the presence of maybe stun gun injuries on Kendrick's body, and that too was omitted from official reports. So I hope y'all are starting to see where we're going here, right? We have blunt force trauma injuries. We've got stun gun injuries. We've got missing video footage. we have a wonky cause of death that doesn't make sense. We have missing internal organs. None of this is normal, y'all. None of this is normal. And also, a second shoe, which was allegedly, again, their whole narrative was that, oh, he lost his shoe and he went to go get it and somehow fell and all of this happened. The alleged shoe that he was reaching for was found 30 to 40 feet away from the scene. So clearly, he was not reaching for said shoe when he was here being rolled up in a mat. So as a result of the autopsy and the botched investigation by the GBI, obviously prosecution couldn't happen. The prosecutors had nothing to go forward with. So in 2021, the Lowndes County Sheriff reopened the investigation, but closed it again in 2022, saying, oh, it's an accident. So the Johnson family, at the end, completely at their wits' end, filed a lawsuit in 2023 alleging violations of their civil rights, due process, and racial discrimination. And let's be clear, Valdosta, Georgia, not the most diverse place you'll ever find. And, y'all can look into the history of Valdosta, Georgia. So some of the allegations include a conspiracy to interfere with civil rights because the defendant allegedly tampered with evidence and obstructed justice, deprivation of civil rights because the Johnson family was denied access to records and evidence under Georgia's Open Records Act. So you can make a demand to see certain records. You're doing a public records request because you want to see the documents and understand what's going on. Media does it all the time. It's a common practice. But the family was denied the ability to see all the key pieces of evidence and documents that were involved. And then, of course, false report and obstruction because, hello, the cause of death is clearly not what was put in the reports. Now, the family is suing the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, the Valdosta Lowndes Regional Crime Lab, the County Board of Education, someone by the name of John Doe, who is believed to be an FBI agent, and the Office of the Attorney General. So where we are right now, they've taken their case to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. This week, the Federal Appeals Court reversed the dismissal of the case. So initially, they had filed this lawsuit. Trial court dismissed it, saying, you can't do this under Georgia law. Thanks for playing. Move on. They appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, and they were like, no, this needs to be reconsidered and sent it back down to the trial court. So as it stands, the Johnsons are still trying to fight for justice for their son and to, first of all, find out what actually happened, who actually killed him, and to hold to account the people who were covering up this crime, which is starting to make me think like it's some sheriff's son or something like that, because none of this is making any sense. And the extent to which this cover-up is done tells me it's somebody who's high up and has a lot of connections, right? This isn't just like a random kid who was in the class and a fight went awry. Something else here is at play. So in terms of next steps for the family, of course, they're still pushing in terms of trying to get resolution from the legal system. They have a website, Justice for Kendrick Johnson. They founded, the mother, Jacqueline Johnson, founded the Kendrick Johnson Foundation and 50 Mothers of Georgia, which advocates for families affected by racial injustice and violence. And there's also fundraising efforts to help support school safety initiatives and provide community aid when these types of things happen. So I encourage anyone and everyone who, is touched by the story. Number one, read up more about it. I'm always one to send and give y'all links to be able to learn more about the case. If you know any information, if you know anybody in Valdosta or who went to that school around that time frame, please give some information because this family deserves to know what happened to their child. And before I leave you today, I will be answering the question of the week, which comes from Canada. And so our viewer said, how is setting up replacement law enforcement services done in terms of reassuring the general population that we'll be safe? Who is responsible for doing it, and how is it done? Now, this question was in response to last week's Mondays with Melba, where I talked about the Sonia Massey case and the issues that the Minneapolis Police Department were having and all of that, and just sort of like these horrible cases that we're seeing of police brutality. So to answer the question directly, normally the way these police departments are held to account is through what's called a consent decree. That means the U.S. Department of Justice, the feds, would come in and they would basically monitor that particular police department. They would be in charge of looking at hiring practices, how cases are handled, their investigation practices, everything. The police department can't make a move unless the federal consent decree monitor, the person who from the federal government is in charge of oversight of that department, they can't make a move unless the monitor approves it. Now, also, we've seen local city councils, local commissions, as well as mayors and the such intervene in these types of cases. And we've seen this happen with the Minneapolis City Council, who, put a lot of restrictions in place in terms of their police department. Also, we saw in the state of New Jersey at one point, an entire police department was basically disbanded, and they started from scratch, rehiring and basically saying, listen, our new mantra is going to be, service, de-escalation. We're not going to be using force for everything. We're going to be more involved in the community. And basically, if you are someone who was part of the old guard and believe in that new mission, you could reapply and get a job. But mostly they were looking for brand new people who subscribe to the theory of true community policing and true, de-escalation tactics and not using violence as the answer to every situation they encounter. Here's the thing, though. There's no foolproof way to be able to reassure the community, because now presently, under this new presidential administration, the Department of Civil Rights under the Department of Justice has basically been disbanded. And they were the ones who were responsible for investigating police departments and putting these federal consent decrees in place. So you're not going to get help from the federal level anymore. So now it's up to mayors and city council and county commissions and all of that to basically put pressure on the sheriff's department or the chief of police to make sure that certain protocols are being followed. But there has to be a political will. And if, sometimes they don't want to have that fight with the police department. You then also have the issue of police departments feeling upset that they're being questioned. And so they're like, well, we're just not going to police. And basically will not respond to calls or will just respond late. Because again, they're just like, well, if you don't trust us, then we don't trust you and we won't be bothered. You guys can just kill yourself. So that kind of vindictiveness also plays out as well. So at this juncture, to be honest, we don't have a great system on how to handle this. Lots of really intelligent people have got together and put together different plans. We had the, 21st century policing guide that came out under President Obama's administration. I mean, we had some points in history where it seemed like we were moving forward, but under this current administration, we're going to be moving completely backwards when it comes to that. Wish I had better news, but that's where we are. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and thank you for tuning in for another Mondays with Melba. If you enjoy the content on this channel, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and tell a friend. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Court Authorities, part of the Midas Touch Network. We're at the intersection of law, politics, and true crime. I'm Dave Ehrenberg, aka the Florida Lawman. If you want more of this content, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.